Yes, like Juan said, um, this is the topic. So about the open source and standardization, and especially now in the context of the CRA. So that's the kind of frame. Of course, there are other environments where the collaboration is necessary and crucial, but I use the CRA because it's the one that has been for the past couple of years closest to me. And the time budget, of course, here, as we all know, is 45 minutes. Don't really know if I would fancy to talk all that. Maybe I would be much more pleased if I would be able to get some discussion about the topic. So I would maybe go through the presentation as I have prepared it, and then we could entertain whatever aspects you may have in your mind to elaborate on, because this is something that is an ongoing effort, a dilemma, and not solved by any means yet. So a little bit of me. Juan already told some details. This goes in a way of like, why would I be kind of qualified to stand here and talk about this topic of these two things and how they should go together. So I am in Nokia Open Source Program Office. And mainly in addition to regulatory aspects, I deal with the automation and orchestration in open source. So all kinds of projects that land there. But regulation or the CRA-related things have recently been maybe more time-consuming. I also do have some lengthy background history on industry collaboration. So a couple of decades in the actual standardization in different organizations, and now recently a little bit more than a decade in the open source front. And yeah, Juan told we have this open regulatory compliance working group in the Eclipse now for a second year up and running. I've been co-chairing it from the beginning with Dirk Willem from Apache Foundation. I'm a native Finn. That's a warning, because we've been told that we are sometimes blunt, and I'm not going to shy away from that because I just don't know how to. And I did some computer science in the early years, so I believe I know something of the technology as well, even if I've been with this industry collaboration for quite some time. Always need to have pictures, so a couple of pictures. None of them really tied to the topic, maybe to me, but definitely not the topic. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about Nokia and open source. And the reason for that is that while I'm standing here and said a couple of times this open regulatory compliance, this is necessarily a manufacturer view as well. It is impossible to distinguish, or me to distinguish that angle from any of this talk. And then of course some of maybe individual views as well. So let's. So this is not a company spill, not intended to be, but there are two messages I probably would like people to take away from this. Is that today there's no mobile phones. So Nokia and mobile phones are not together anymore. So we are a company that delivers critical infrastructure in form of network equipment, be it mobile, fixed, optical, be it to the operators, as we know, or to web scalers, data centers. That's the kind of the technology and the business environment we are revolving around. something that comes with that is a regulatory regime. So telecommunications has been from the very beginning highly regulated environment. So from the company point of view, CRA as a regulation is not kind of a new thing, or regulation is not a new thing. We have learned to live with it and make best out of it. So from that point of view, kind of a little bit easier for me to enter the CRA trenches than, for example, somebody who is like die-hard open source person and has not had this encounter with the regulatory environment. And the other thing probably worthwhile to notice is the, where is it? That one. So patents are a big thing for us and in our industry, and that doesn't always go well with the open source constituency, but so now you know that as well. So it's not a secret, and it does have some implication on a way that we deal with these questions. But that's all for the company. About the open source, why do we care? So we do have a fairly long history. You barely can see it, but it starts from the 1990s. And then there are multiple milestones. You probably don't see them, not necessarily to read them, but in the material you can then study. But it tells you that we've been there from fairly early on, and then we have upped our game by kind of being founders of certain open source environments. So open source is really important for the company. So we say that some of our products are built with open source or contain open source, and then there are others that are kind of pretty much open source that we then put some additional stuff there. So it's like a continuum of how much there is, but there is a lot. So this is something that has to work for us in like the community-wise and all those collaborations that we are going to discuss soon about with the standardization and open source. So it says about our kind of high-level strategy on how we deal with open source. It's about low differentiation areas and reaching compatibility with through the ecosystem. So that's the kind of technical open source. The CRA is a little bit different animal, as we know, but still, these are the guiding principles. And now that we are, so as I said, open source and standards are something that are readily in our, I would say, DNA. So these are part of what we call openness, Nokia openness model. So they contribute to that thought and driver of openness. Because in an environment like a global mobile network, where you come to Brussels, regardless of if you travel from Shanghai or New York or Antarctica, your mobile functions. And that's because there's interoperability, there are standards, and there are solutions that are built with the openness and interoperability in mind. If that wouldn't exist, then the whole ecosystem would be totally different. So that's why this openness as a bigger concept is very relevant for us. But now I stop talking about the company. I'm diving into the interplay of standardization and open source. I trust everybody knows what we talk about when we talk about the global, when we talk about Cyber Resiliency Act, CRA. Anybody who doesn't know what those three letters stand for? Good, because I didn't inject a slide explaining that. What I did instead was that it's not only about the law text. Well, that we all know already by now. Most of us know. There might be some who still don't. So we have harmonized standards, which is a concept in the European legislation environment. There are European standards organizations that are listed there, Senelec and ETSI, who have the mandate to write those harmonized standards when the Commission so asks and they agree. So that's going to be part of what goes with the CRA. Then we have other stuff, which is no less relevant, which is the Commission's implementing act, delegated acts, all kinds of guidelines, guidances. They have different bearing than somebody else's white papers, so they are relevant. And then there are all kinds of industry best practices, like something that the ORC has been working on and delivering. So there is plenty of things that are ongoing with somewhat different relevance or legal bearing, but still really something that needs to be observed and engaged with. Especially thinking from the open source community point of view, we need to get all these right. Then there is a triangle that many of us have seen so many times and have fallen in love with. Gives you an idea of a structure of the harmonized standards, which was the Commission standardization request with 40-something topics on it, and that's how it then kind of fell out. So there is something that is called horizontals, worked by Senelec, and verticals. Currently, my esteemed colleague over here can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's around 18 groups currently working in ETSI on these different things. So individual standards coming for specific vertical industry area at some point. And maybe this gives a kind of landscape picture how it works out. So I think if we stare this slide for a moment and start to think that CRA touches open source quite significantly and pretty much first time ever in law context. Now we have this number of different areas where standards are being worked on to explain and put some requirements on products with digital elements. And all of these have potential to have something on open source. So who wants to start going through them and check which ones has and does it really matter? It's a daunting task. And pretty much that was what the open source community was up against when all this show started and took form. So the challenge is, obviously, there was clarity on CRA text. That's why ORC actually started, was that there was no clarity. There was a lot of fear, a lot of misconception, a lot of I want to walk away because this makes my life miserable if it comes into force as it is written, and all that. Where does that leave me as a maintainer, as a contributor, as somebody who loves open source and wants to make world better with it? Then input to standards. So if you still remember the previous slide, how do you then influence that? What are the ways? It's some 3 or 4 or 5 letter acronym somewhere. How do you get involved with them? And to be honest, you don't. Well, at least you didn't in the beginning because there was no way. For one, it was through some national standardization body. Who has heard about those? What are those? How do I get access to those? Only through them you could get access to some of it. And then there was some obscure southern French establishment, how do you get involved with them? So challenges. Interfacing with regulators. So direct contact with the Commission people because they are writing the stuff, the guidances and those things. How do we get handled? We just over the lunch discussed this, that you send an email to somebody in Commission and then you die of old age before you see any response. So that doesn't work. And then the awareness thing, like for the community. Try to make people at ease that it's not so bad, that it might be better and we can actually do something that helps. So that was the challenge environment that we were up against. So what did we do? We organized ourselves. We created an open regulatory compliance working group in Eclipse, and then a little later, an open SSF global cyber policy working group, with the focus on let's get our act together in context of the CRA and start learning how to overcome those challenges on the previous slide. So that's where it all started. And of course, I have to say that both of these groups are planning to expand their focus, or how you expand focus. But anyway, so kind of not only focus on CRA, but take some other regulatory activities into their scope when they emerge. And that was already, it's by design. It was something that was agreed early on. CRA, of course, was the burning thing, but there are others on the way. So these two groups started to function and have done a mighty job so far. So here's a little bit of what the ORC has done. So there's all kinds of documentation, there's white papers in planning, input contributions to the Commission standardization, so forth, and other form of materials like specifications. So here and then the global cyber policy working group sort of in a similar way, just highlighting some of the things. So what happened was that those challenges that we saw and those kind of no access to standardization, no easy access to standardization. So what we did was that these organizations stepped up and kind of improved their game and made it possible for them to attend the standardization. So they got a place in the room, and they were allowed to speak. So they were able to make a difference. So that was a decisive moment when things started to turn to right direction. So now we had a channel. Now we had a way to collaborate with the standardization and then of course with the Commission. But that's what it required. And it took a while. I mean, it took few months for both of these to be kind of off the ground and people getting to know them and getting involved and starting to collaborate and contribute. So what we then learned when we started to be able to attend this standardization organization, first of all, they are independent from each other, so they do have different working practices. So it doesn't really cut that you know how the Sentinel works at the ETSI side or vice versa. So you need to learn both ways. So it's like a lot of learning. They do have their own working practices that work for them well and have worked for them well. I mean, think about current mobile network standards, thousands of documents and tens of thousands of pages. And it works. They get it done for every bloody release that they work on. And now it's the sixth generation coming up. So it works. You can't argue against it. You can argue against it if it works well in this CRA context, but by and large, works. And the big question in the standardization setting is reaching consensus. And then, of course, comes how do you define consensus. But anyway, so that's their target. That's the main target. So they want to reach that so that they can close the books, and now that's what has been agreed. And they do have means to get there. So then, when we entered, now I'm using we as open source communities to this place, we had to first learn their ways of working. And we probably didn't like them so much. We are not so used to in those practices and felt that maybe those are archaic. And there are much better ways, flexible ways. We just throw PRs and people put plus ones, and we get things rolling. It didn't happen in that side with their Word documents and weekly calls. So, a challenge. And of course then, even if we had these groups, these two groups there, our way of organizing ourselves was still not exactly cut for this challenge, because it was still a kind of loose collection of people, and when you need to get a specific opinion representing this community, it's a challenging task with a loose collaboration way of working that we have in the open source. So we were kind of stuck sometimes with not being able to articulate what actually we are looking for and what we are asking for. And then we'd of course notice that it's a profession, the standardization. So those people have been doing for a long time. Open source folks are not professional standardization people. So there's a friction there, obviously, and we don't want to be. So it's like we have something more interesting and important in our days to work on than sit in a meeting. So again, not exactly the right, well, not exactly an approach that would easily allow us to be as efficient as we would like to be in that standardization environment. And then, of course, not only the foundations, so Eclipse and OpenSSF, were putting effort on, but also then quite soon we noticed that we do have actually colleagues in open source communities who do have access to those standardization organizations, who do have some experience there, and who are willing to talk on behalf of the open source community. Like, well, I was one of those because of the company affiliation, had access to all of those places where the standards were discussed. So of course then we had other people who were sharing the same possibilities or having the same possibilities, so we started to collaborate. So we kind of donated, the same way as we donate to the open source our contributions, we donated our time and effort to coordinate somewhat the open source input to the standards, if you like. And then fairly soon we started to hear from the open source, from the standardization folks, that they actually appreciated the engagement. So it started to bear some fruit. So we were listened to, we were asked, and things started to work. So it wasn't all uphill struggle from beginning until now. Something nice also happened along the way. But still, I think the biggest problem I saw was that we were not really efficient and able to provide coherent and to the point contribution from open source with the given time constraints, because then of course you need to understand that the document that they are writing has a timeline and a practice how they want to develop it. You need to contribute at the right time. And that was not always very easy. Again, referring to this little bit kind of free-floating way of organizing the open source discussion on this topic. So, getting close to the end. Now, been describing the way it was started, how we got engaged, and how we overcome some of the first hurdles. So, with contributing or collaborating with the standardization. What lies ahead, or how can we then move forward with this activity? Because we assume that we need to continue with the collaboration still some time to come. Some good indications have been there that the ESOs, so the standardization organizations, have been willing to adapt slightly their ways of working. Like Etsy, for example, they have something kind of a Git-like tool available. It's not extensively utilized to the best of its abilities, but it is there. So it's not only Word documents that you need to edit, but you can do something that is more familiar for the open source community. And also they have started to share their draft materials earlier on than what had been practiced before. So earlier it was like only those members who were part of the happy family had the access to drafts, but nowadays they do share it more widely. So little nudges to the direction to help other people who are not intimately into the standardization. Senselec is a little bit more challenging thing, but let's see if that works better. We had a letter, what we call letter to the ESOs sent out, so both to the Senselec and to the Etsy, kind of highlighting this, that we need to be part of it. We are part of this, but we need to be able to engage. So what are the challenges, and what would be the proposed ways forward to solve those challenges? So we've highlighted this, what I said already, limited access to working documents, and then these meeting frequencies and face-to-face or video call meetings, not asynchronous way of working, and not even having access to meeting calendars always. So of course that's kind of defeats the purpose. Can't access if you don't know that the meeting happens. So then some proposals were shared, and that dialogue just needs to continue, and we need to kind of emphasize that these are not solved things. This is something that still needs some improvement, and then of course be thankful for the little nudges that take place. I'm not gonna read through all those bullets, but especially this kind of optimizing the value of the synchronous meetings, meaning the face-to-face meetings or the video conferences. So have a good agenda, have as much as possible pointed out kind of the times when certain things are being discussed, because, well, people who don't have the luxury of spending 2 full days on a week in a meeting, they would need to understand where the topic that they feel strongly about happens. So that kind of making those changes doesn't seem to be an easy thing to happen. So easy thing to happen, but still, this is something that we are kind of hoping for to take place little by little. And I think it has improved. I think we currently have the agendas that are a little bit better, and I'm now referring to the Sensenelec part because that was, for me, that was like the newer environment, and I was blown off with the agenda which says that the meeting starts at 9:30, we have coffee at 11, lunch at 12:30, coffee at 5, and go and close the meeting at 5:30. Nothing in between. So it's like, all right, that's an agenda, but I just don't know what's going to be on the meeting. Now they have more specific things, so things have improved. Okay. This is the things that I would like to kind of leave you with my thoughts on kind of way forward. Assuming first of all that CRA is not one-off, because if it is, if we think that it is, then we don't need to think about these things too much. We just survive with the current thing and forget it. It was a nightmare and move on. But if we think that with the regulation and the harmonized standardization, it exists and it has an impact to open source, then probably we want to do some things better than what we've done so far together. So I said already, continue the dialogue and propose the improvements. I mean, we need to be active. Changes don't happen if we don't push for them. We need to show that we are active, we care, and there are still things to be improved. And especially in the context of these harmonized European norms, because technical standards, I think that's a little bit different story. But especially I think this is relevant because it's about law. So we need those things, obstacles need to be removed as much as possible when it applies to law that has some bearing with open source. And then, of course, helping ourselves to understand things is that learn how that standardization works and why does it work the way it does. There are reasons for that. Some of them are historical, but then there are other things like good reasons why it works. This consensus seeking, then making sure that you end up with a consensus decision. So there's merit in there. And then us here, what is the open source community with? That's kind of an interesting question because I would be hesitant to say that the view that the ORC working group provides to the outside would be the open source view, or that the view that the global cyber policy working group from OpenSSF comes up with the position. I wouldn't say that even that isn't the open source view. So that is, I think it's a true kind of challenge on how we kind of come to that. I don't have an answer to that. But maybe it's worthwhile to kind of discuss and debate within our community that when are we happy with an open source view formed. And then I think the last point, which kind of, maybe I got some war scars when trying to inject some of the open source software steward definitions into the Sensenelec harmonized standard, failed miserably, and walk away with tail between my legs. Let's try and also improve here on that area. So how do we get these things coherent, timely, and such that we all agree on it as much as possible, and it's an impactful contribution, so that also the other side or the audience understands what do we say and why do we say what we say. Done. Thank you.
Thank you, Timo. We have time for at least one question. Any question from the audience?
Please.
Hi. One question. Is open source fit for standardization? Because in my view, I mean, don't know too much about standardization, but in my view, standardization a little bit fixes the boundaries which cannot be changed. So open source is something, in my opinion, which is more flexible. So this is why I put the question.
Yeah, and I think that is a very good question. Thank you. I don't have a perfect answer to this or anything else for that matter, but it's like I would address this in a context of the CRA or the harmonized European norm standardization, which is like the fringes of the regulation. So I think it is difficult because the standardization is not in the DNA of an open source. We create code, but when it comes to regulation, creating code doesn't cut it because you need to have an impact on actually something that is written, which is closer to standards. So I think here there is a lot of kind of upskilling, so getting skills into the game in the open source community where we can provide then meaningful contributions. So, but it's I think challenging probably is the word, and it's a new territory. So that's the other thing, that it's like we are not used to that kind of way of working and that kind of deliverables. So that it goes. I kind of think strongly that it goes to this slide where I just highlighted a couple of things that what we as an open source community should be improving in this game. So that answer to that question finds its home in that slide. We don't have the answer, at least in my view, but we need to.
One more.
Sure, Alistair.
Yeah, so just a comment to your question or observation. Two rebuttals, slight rebuttals. So I work on multiple open source projects, and the first observation is one of them, many of them follow IETF standards and a whole bunch of other things and have been implementing open source standards for the longest period of time. I can think of all the web browsers. Mozilla does W3C stuff. I mean, following standards is not difficult for open source projects, assuming that they want to. For ones that don't want to because they want to be creative, they don't. But for the ones that want to interoperate with other people's equipment, they do a very good job. The routing stacks that I work with, we support BGP, ISIS, OSPF, and everything else that the IETF does. And this is all open source. The guys who do DNS resolvers, all that's open source, and they stand up in the IETF meetings and do all these standards. So I would make a very hard rebuttal to the fact that projects can't do this. Some of them decide to because of the field that they're in. Many do not. So I agree with that, but some are very, very good at doing the standards and are better than commercial products many times. So I wouldn't want that observation to just sit in the room. The other one is a lot of this stuff is related to process. And following process is something that open source projects can decide to do or not do. And a lot of the standardization work that is being done here is process related. And then deciding to opt in to follow a standard process, including the ability to file your vulnerabilities and doing other types of things, is just a process thing. It doesn't make a statement about whether the code is doing something one way or another way. And this just makes it clear for other people that you're doing things in that particular regard. So I'm not trying to pick a fight, I'm just making the observation that the initial thing was not quite accurate about the fact that it's a choice for open source projects. And many of them would quite happily follow process standards, and we're already following technical standards where it's appropriate.
Thank you, Alistair. Thank you, Timo.